They say one moment can change your life forever. I never believed that until the night I walked into that room and saw something I was never meant to see. I wish I could tell you I looked away, that I turned around, closed the door, and erased that moment from my memory before it had the chance to ruin everything. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, frozen. My mind was screaming at me to leave, to pretend I hadn't seen it. But my body refused to move. It was like time had stopped, trapping me in that unbearable, forbidden moment. My heart pounded so hard in my chest, I was sure he could hear it. And that's when it happened. He looked up. His eyes met mine, and in that second, something shifted. I felt it. He felt it. It was like an invisible thread had been pulled tight between us, snapping the last fragile boundary that had kept us safe. I should have run. I should have slammed the door, forced myself to forget. But the problem with some moments? They don't just happen. They brand themselves into your soul. That moment, it changed everything. I wish I could say I didn't see it coming, that I had no idea the path we were heading down. But if I'm being honest with you, the signs were always there. Little things, subtle moments, passing glances that lingered a little too long. Looking back, I realize it was never just one moment. It was 1,000 small ones, adding up to something neither of us knew how to stop. And now? Now I'm left here, trying to pick up the pieces of a life I barely recognize. But let me take you back to the beginning, before that night, before the moment that destroyed the last piece of who I thought I was. Because if I had seen what was coming, maybe, just maybe, I could have stopped it. Or maybe, deep down, I didn't want to. Before we dive into this confession, make sure to subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Let me take you back. Back to before the moment that changed everything. Back to when I was just a woman, a wife, a stepmother, living a life that, from the outside, probably seemed normal. But normal is such a deceptive word, isn't it? My name doesn't really matter. What matters is who I was, or at least, who I used to be. I was a woman in my late 30s, married for 10 years to a man I once loved with everything in me. But love is like a candle, isn't it? It flickers, it burns bright, and if you don't protect it, it goes out. And that's exactly what happened to us. At first, it was little things. Missed date nights. Conversations that never went beyond, "How was your day?" The way he stopped looking at me like I was something to be adored and started looking at me like I was just there. Then it became more than that. Nights spent alone in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence where laughter used to be. Kisses that became obligations. Touches that felt more like routines than desires. And eventually, he just wasn't there at all. My husband traveled for work a lot. Weeks at a time, sometimes a full month would pass with nothing but a few dry text messages and the occasional half-hearted phone call. And when he was home, he was still somewhere else. Lost in his own world, his own thoughts, his own routine that no longer included me. I became invisible. And when a woman feels invisible for long enough, she starts craving to be seen. Then, there was him. My stepson. The son from my husband's first marriage, a marriage he never liked to talk about. He was 21. A young man trying to figure out his place in the world. He had been away at college for years, only visiting on holidays, barely more than a presence that drifted in and out of our lives. But now he was home. He had moved back in after graduation, trying to save money before finding a place of his own. A temporary arrangement, my husband had said. Just a few months. At first, I barely noticed him. He was polite, quiet, kept to himself. We coexisted under the same roof, sharing small talk in passing, exchanging brief nods at dinner. But then something changed. It started subtly, so subtly I didn't even realize it was happening. The way his eyes would linger a second too long when I walked into the room. The way his voice would soften when he spoke to me, as if he was seeing me in a way no one had in a long time. And maybe that's what it was. Maybe it wasn't him at all. Maybe it was just me, a woman who had spent too many nights feeling lonely in a marriage that felt more like an arrangement than a love story. A woman who had been starved for attention for so long, she didn't even recognize it when it was given to her. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Something neither of us saw coming. Our house was a quiet one. Not the cozy kind of quiet where peace and comfort fill the air. No, it was the heavy kind, the kind that weighed on you, made the air thick, made every silence feel like something was missing. It was a big house, too big for the lack of warmth inside it. A modern suburban home, clean and pristine on the outside, but cold and empty on the inside. A house where my husband's absence echoed in every room. A house where I spent most of my nights alone, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine, staring at my phone, waiting for a message from a man who had stopped missing me years ago. And now, there was another presence in that house. A presence I hadn't paid much attention to before. A presence that was suddenly impossible to ignore. I remember the first time I really noticed him. Not as my stepson. Not as my husband's son. But as a man. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, lost in my own thoughts. He walked in, grabbed a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. It was nothing. Just an ordinary moment. A few words exchanged. A casual glance. But then, he smiled. Not just any smile. A knowing smile. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a very, very long time. I felt seen. And that was the beginning of the end. It happened on a night like any other. Or at least, that's what I told myself. The house was quiet, the kind of unsettling silence that comes when you've lived too long with someone who no longer speaks to you unless it's necessary. My husband was gone, another business trip, another excuse, another night of me lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how a person could feel so alone while still being married. I had poured myself a glass of wine. Maybe two. The kind of habit that starts as a way to pass the time and then becomes something else entirely. I wasn't thinking about him. I wasn't thinking about anything, really, as I made my way down the dimly lit hallway, barefoot against the cold wooden floor. I was heading to my room, ready to disappear beneath the sheets and pretend I wasn't drowning in my own loneliness. But then, I heard it. A faint sound. Soft. A rhythm that didn't belong to the stillness of the house. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Maybe the wind outside. Maybe the house settling. But as I got closer, I knew that wasn't it. The door was open, just a sliver, just enough for the light to spill through, casting a thin golden line across the hallway floor. I should have walked away. I should have ignored it. But I didn't. Curiosity is a dangerous thing. It sneaks up on you, whispers in your ear, convinces you to take one more step when you know you shouldn't. So I did. And what I saw, it changed everything. There he was. His back was to me, his muscles tense, his breath uneven. He hadn't noticed me. He was lost in his own moment, completely unaware that someone was standing there, watching. I should have left. I should have turned away the second my brain registered what I was seeing. But instead, I stood there, frozen. My heart pounded, my throat went dry, my entire body locked in place as if rooted to the ground. Because it wasn't just the act itself that stole my breath. It was his face. The way his jaw clenched. The way his lips parted on a heavy exhale. The way his body moved, slow, deliberate, unapologetic. I didn't even realize I was holding my breath. And then, he looked up. I felt it before I even saw it. That exact moment when he became aware of my presence. When his body stilled, when his gaze shifted, when his eyes met mine. For a heartbeat, time stopped. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. The air between us turned electric, charged with something unspoken, something unnameable, something forbidden. And then, slowly, his expression changed. Not shock. Not embarrassment. Understanding. That was the moment everything shifted. Not just because I had seen him, but because he had seen me. I don't remember how I got back to my room. One second I was standing in that doorway, caught in something I couldn't explain, and the next, I was slamming my door shut, pressing my back against the cool wood, heart racing in my chest. I felt like I had just run a marathon. My legs were weak, my hands shook, my entire body hummed with something I didn't want to name. What the hell had just happened? Why hadn't I looked away? Why had I stood there like I was waiting for something to happen? But the worst part? The part that made my stomach twist in knots, that made me want to sink into the floor and disappear? I wasn't disgusted. I wasn't horrified. I was something else entirely. Something I didn't want to admit. Something that sent a heat curling deep in my stomach, even as my brain screamed at me to forget it, to pretend it never happened. But forgetting wasn't an option. Because the second he saw me, something changed. And from that night on, nothing between us would ever be the same. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the room suffocatingly dark and silent, but my mind was anything but still. It replayed the moment over and over again, like a film I couldn't turn off, each frame seared into my memory with unbearable clarity. I could still see him. The way his muscles tensed. The way his breath hitched. The way his eyes, those dark, knowing eyes, held mine without flinching. And worst of all, the way my body had reacted. I felt sick with myself. This was wrong. So wrong. He was my husband's son. He wasn't mine, no, but that didn't matter. It should have never mattered. I was supposed to be the adult in this situation, the responsible one, the one who knew where the lines were drawn. So why did it feel like those lines were already blurring? I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my palms against them as if I could somehow erase the images from my mind. But I couldn't, because the truth, the horrible, shameful truth, was that I hadn't looked away. I had stayed, watched, and now my body wouldn't forget. Neither would my mind. And the worst part? Neither would he. The next morning, I told myself things would go back to normal. That I could pretend like it never happened. That I could just walk into the kitchen, pour my coffee, sit across from him at the table like I had done 100 times before, and everything would be the same. But I was wrong. The moment I stepped into the room, I felt it. The shift. It was subtle, but undeniable. The air between us was heavier, charged with something unspoken, something dangerous. He was already at the table, sipping his coffee, his posture relaxed, but there was an edge to him now, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. And then, he did it. He looked up. And when his gaze met mine, I felt it all over again. That slow, deliberate understanding. I swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the counter, willing myself to be normal. To say something casual, something harmless. Morning. My voice came out too tight. Too careful. Morning, he replied, and I hated how smooth he sounded. Like nothing had changed. Like I hadn't seen him. Like we hadn't stood there, frozen in that moment together. But the way his eyes lingered just a second too long told me otherwise. He knew. And worse? He wasn't ashamed. I turned away, my hands trembling as I reached for my coffee mug, trying to steady my breath, my thoughts, my pulse. But the awareness was still there, curling in the pit of my stomach like a forbidden secret, one I couldn't ignore no matter how much I wanted to. This is wrong. I repeated it in my head like a mantra, hoping if I said it enough, it would drown out the other voice, the one whispering things I wasn't ready to hear. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake it off. I cleaned. I went for a walk. I tried to distract myself with meaningless tasks, forcing my thoughts anywhere but on him. But no matter what I did, he was there. Not physically, but in my mind. The way he had looked at me. The way something had shifted between us. And then, of course, there was my husband. I heard from him late that evening. A short, impersonal text. Hey, busy day. Hope you're okay. I stared at the screen for a long time, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Hope you're okay. That was it? After 10 years of marriage? After all the nights I had spent alone, waiting for him to remember I existed? I typed back, I'm fine. But I wasn't fine. I was unraveling. I could feel it. And the worst part? I didn't know if I wanted to stop it. That night I heard him again. Late. Past midnight. I was lying in bed, curled beneath the covers, trying to force myself to sleep, when I heard the soft creak of floorboards down the hall. Footsteps. His footsteps. I held my breath, my pulse drumming in my ears. Was he coming this way? A part of me wanted to throw the covers over my head, to hide from whatever this was before it spiraled even further out of control. But another part of me, a darker part, didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened. He stopped just outside my door. The air grew thick, charged with something invisible but undeniable. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he walked away. The next few days were torture. Every time we were in the same room, the energy crackled like a storm on the verge of breaking. I felt him watching me. I felt his presence like a flame licking at the edges of my control. But I avoided him. I had to. Because the moment I acknowledged what was happening, the moment I let myself feel it, there would be no going back. I told myself it would pass. That it was nothing more than a fleeting temptation, a product of my own loneliness, my own desperate need to be seen. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't going away. It was only getting stronger. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I wanted it to stop. I told myself I was imagining it. That I was reading too much into things, twisting innocent moments into something they weren't. But deep down, I knew better. Because things had changed. He had changed. Or maybe it was me. Maybe I was the one who had shifted, who had started seeing him differently, who had started feeling differently. It started with the little things. Things that wouldn't mean anything to someone on the outside. Things that could be brushed off as nothing but felt like everything. The first time it happened, it was barely noticeable. I was in the kitchen, reaching for a glass from the top shelf. It was just out of reach, and before I could grab the step stool, he was there. Behind me. Close. Too close. His arm reached over mine, his chest brushing against my back as he effortlessly grabbed the glass and set it on the counter in front of me. Here, he said, voice low. I swallowed hard, my body frozen, trapped in the unexpected heat of his presence. Thanks, I murmured, stepping away quickly, pretending like my pulse wasn't hammering in my throat. It should have been nothing. A simple, fleeting moment. But I felt it. And from the way his gaze lingered on me as I walked away, I knew he felt it too. Then, there were the compliments. Not the usual, polite ones. Not the kind a stepson gives his stepmother out of courtesy. No, these were different. More personal. More intentional. You look nice today, he said one afternoon, his voice casual, but his eyes weren't. I laughed it off, brushing a hand over my dress. Oh, this? I just threw it on. He tilted his head, his lips curving slightly. Well, it suits you. It was harmless. But the way he said it? The way his eyes didn't look away? It sent something dangerous curling through me. Then, there was the way he watched me. Not obviously. Not in a way anyone else would notice. But I noticed. I felt his gaze on me when I wasn't looking. I caught it lingering just a little too long when we passed each other in the hallway. There was a weight to it. A question. A waiting. Like he was seeing how far I'd let this go. And then came the touch. It happened when we were fixing something in the house. A cabinet door had come loose and he offered to help. It was innocent. Just a simple task. But when I reached to steady the door and he reached at the same time, our hands touched. Not a quick graze. Not something meaningless. But something that lasted just a second too long. His fingers against mine, warm and steady. And neither of us moved. Neither of us pulled away. The air shifted, thickening, wrapping around us, trapping us in something neither of us wanted to name. My breath caught. I saw the way his throat bobbed, the way his jaw tensed, like he was fighting something, holding something back. And I should have pulled away. I should have laughed it off, made some joke, pretended it wasn't what it was. But I didn't. Instead, I felt it. Let myself feel it. That quiet, forbidden thrill. That pulse of something dark and dangerous curling beneath my skin. And then, he moved first. Pulled his hand away. Cleared his throat. Looked at me for one long second before stepping back. And in that second, I knew. We had crossed an invisible line. We weren't just imagining this anymore. That night, I lay awake again. Torn. Confused. Terrified. Because this wasn't just a fleeting temptation anymore. It wasn't just a moment of weakness. This was something growing. Something neither of us had the strength to stop. I told myself it was nothing. Just my mind playing tricks on me. Just my loneliness making me desperate for attention. But then, I caught myself waiting for the next moment. Anticipating it. Watching him more than I should. Thinking about him when I shouldn't. And that's when I knew. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. This was dangerous. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to be saved. The night it happened, the air was thick with something unspoken. Outside, the storm raged, wind howling against the house, rain lashing against the windows in relentless sheets. The power had gone out not long after sunset, plunging the house into darkness. Just the two of us. Alone. The glow of candlelight flickered in the living room, throwing soft, golden shadows against the walls. It should have felt eerie, unsettling. But it didn't. It felt intimate. Too intimate. I should have gone to bed. I should have walked away. But instead I stayed. He had opened a bottle of wine, pouring us both a glass. Might as well make the best of it, he had said, handing it to me with that knowing look. That look that had become dangerous. And instead of refusing, instead of putting up the walls that I should have built between us, I took it. I took the glass. I took the moment. And I let myself fall into something I wasn't ready to name. At first, the conversation was light. Safe. We talked about nothing and everything. Little things. Silly things. Childhood memories, funny stories, moments that shouldn't have meant anything but did. But then the laughter faded. The pauses grew longer. The words became heavier. And then, he asked the question. Are you happy? The words hung in the air between us, their weight pressing against my chest. I should have lied. I should have given the easy answer, the expected answer. But I couldn't. Because in that moment, under the glow of flickering candlelight, with his eyes locked onto mine like he was seeing straight into the deepest parts of me, I couldn't lie. So I said nothing. And somehow, that said everything. His gaze didn't waver. He didn't look away. Neither did I. And then, he reached out. It was nothing at first. Just a hand, brushing against mine on the couch, barely touching, but enough. Enough to send a jolt through me. Enough to make my breath hitch. Enough to tell me that if I didn't move now, if I didn't stop this right now, there would be no turning back. But I didn't move. Neither did he. His fingers slid over mine, slow, deliberate, testing, giving me a chance to pull away. I should have. I didn't. And then I looked up. His face was closer than I thought. I could feel his breath, warm, uneven. I could hear the pounding of my own heart, a frantic rhythm that matched the storm outside. And then it happened. His hand lifted, fingers brushing against my jaw, featherlight but electric. A pause. A moment where everything could have still been undone. And then, he kissed me. It was soft at first. A whisper of lips against mine, testing, hesitating, waiting. But the second I let myself lean in, the second I let myself feel it, everything shattered. Heat. Need. Something raw and aching that had been building for far too long, spilling over in a way neither of us could stop. My hands found his shirt, gripping it too tightly. His fingers slid to my waist, pulling me too close. It was reckless. It was forbidden. It was everything I wasn't supposed to want. And yet, in that moment, I wanted nothing else. But then reality crashed back in. Like ice water over my skin. Like a slap to the face. Like a warning. I pulled back. Breathless. Shaking. Terrified. He stared at me, his own breath unsteady, his lips still parted, like he couldn't believe what had just happened either. Like he was just as shaken. Like he knew, just as I did, that nothing could undo what we had just done. What have I done? The words slipped from my lips before I could stop them, barely above a whisper, but he heard them. And his expression shifted. Hurt. Regret. Guilt. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the candle beside me, my hands shaking so hard I thought I might collapse. Hi, I have to go, I choked out, my voice hoarse, barely recognizable. He said nothing. Didn't stop me. Didn't reach for me again. And somehow, that made it worse. Because as I turned, as I fled down the hallway, heart slamming against my ribs, hands trembling as I fumbled for my bedroom door, I knew. There was no coming back from this. The line had been crossed. And nothing would ever be the same again. I barely slept that night. I lay in bed, wrapped in sheets that felt too heavy, my mind spinning in circles, trapped in the aftermath of something I couldn't take back. My lips still burned. My skin still hummed. But my heart? My heart was a storm of regret, of panic, of something else I didn't want to name. I kept telling myself it hadn't happened. That it was a mistake. A lapse in judgment. That if I ignored it hard enough, long enough, it would somehow disappear. But no matter how many times I squeezed my eyes shut, how many times I whispered, "What have I done?" Into the darkness, I couldn't erase him. The way he had looked at me. The way he had touched me. The way he had kissed me like he had been waiting forever to do it. And worse? The way I had kissed him back. The morning after was unbearable. I woke up late, my head pounding, my body heavy with exhaustion, with guilt. I told myself I could avoid him. That if I just stayed in my room long enough, if I waited until he left the house, I wouldn't have to face what we had done. But avoidance wasn't an option. The second I stepped out of my room and into the hallway, I felt it. The shift. The thick, suffocating air that wrapped around us like a noose, tightening with every unspoken word. I heard him before I saw him. Footsteps in the kitchen. The clink of a coffee mug against the counter. The rustling of fabric as he moved, too stiffly, too carefully. And then I turned the corner, and our eyes met. For one long, excruciating second, neither of us moved. The air between us was charged, heavy, dangerous. And then, he looked away. Like he couldn't bear to see me. Like he regretted it. The weight of that realization hit me harder than it should have. I should have been relieved. I should have wanted him to feel the same shame, the same suffocating guilt clawing its way through my chest. But instead, it felt like a slap. Like something inside me had cracked wide open. He didn't say a word. Just grabbed his keys, his bag, and walked out the front door without so much as a glance in my direction. And just like that, he was gone. Leaving me standing in the middle of the kitchen, coffee growing cold in my hands, heart twisting with something I didn't know how to handle. The silence in the house was deafening. Even with the television on, even with the radio playing in the background, even with every door and window open to let in the morning air, it was too quiet. Too empty. I paced the living room, hands shaking, mind racing, stomach twisted in knots. I tried to tell myself this was good. That him leaving, avoiding me, meant he was smart enough to end whatever this was before it ruined us both. But if that were true, why did it feel like something inside me had been torn apart? Why did it feel like something that had just begun had already ended? I forced myself to go about my day, pretending I wasn't waiting. Waiting for the sound of the front door. Waiting for footsteps in the hallway. Waiting for him to come home so we could pretend everything was normal. But he didn't come home. Not that night. Not the next. Not for 3 whole days. By the time my husband returned, I felt like I was drowning in the weight of my own guilt. I could barely look at him. He walked in, tossing his bag on the floor, pressing a distracted kiss against my cheek, barely even noticing when I flinched. "Long week," he muttered, shrugging off his coat. "Missed you." I swallowed hard, my throat tight, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. Missed me. The words felt like a joke. He hadn't noticed the way my body stiffened beneath his touch. Hadn't noticed the way my breath hitched when he brushed past me. Hadn't noticed the way I had changed. Or maybe he just didn't care enough to see it. Days passed. Slow. Heavy. And still, he didn't come home. I told myself I shouldn't care. That he was avoiding me, that it was for the best. But every night I found myself staring at the clock, my heart sinking lower with each hour that passed. Every morning, I forced myself not to check my phone, not to wonder where he was, not to question why the ache in my chest wouldn't go away. But then, finally, he came back. Late one night. I was in the kitchen, staring at the window, lost in my own restless thoughts when I heard the front door open. My breath caught. Footsteps. Soft. Hesitant. I turned, my pulse hammering. And then I saw him. He looked different. Like he hadn't slept. Like he had been carrying the same guilt, the same war inside him that had been eating me alive. He stood there for a long moment, eyes unreadable, hands shoved into his pockets, like he didn't know what to say. Like he didn't know how to face me. And in that moment, I realized something. He wasn't avoiding me because he regretted what had happened. He was avoiding me because he was afraid. Afraid of what it meant. Afraid of what it would lead to. And I was afraid, too. Because the more I looked at him, the more I knew. This wasn't over. No matter how much we pretended. No matter how much we tried to walk away. No matter how much we told ourselves it had been a mistake. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. It should have ended there. That night he walked back through the door, looking at me with something unreadable in his eyes. That night we stood in silence, too much unsaid, too much weighing between us. I should have walked away. Closed the door to whatever this was. But I didn't. Because I couldn't. Because the truth, the horrible, unshakable truth, was that I didn't want it to be over. And that terrified me more than anything. Was it just a mistake? Or did it mean something more? That question haunted me, circling my mind like a vulture waiting for its prey to fall apart. A mistake was something fleeting, a lapse in judgment, a wrong turn that could still be undone. But this wasn't fleeting. It wasn't some drunken misstep, some passing temptation that would fade into the background if I just ignored it hard enough. This was something else. Something bigger. Something that had been building for weeks, maybe longer. And that realization, that terrifying, undeniable realization, was what kept me awake at night. Because if it had meant nothing, it would have been easy to forget. If it had meant nothing, I wouldn't feel this ache, this craving, this unbearable pull every time I looked at him. I avoided mirrors. I couldn't look at myself without seeing it, the truth of what I had done etched into my reflection. I was a wife, a stepmother, and yet I had kissed him. I had let him touch me. I had wanted him to. And what did that make me? A horrible person? A selfish woman? A wife so starved for affection, for connection, that she had crossed the ultimate line just to feel something again? The guilt was suffocating. It clung to me like a second skin, a shadow that followed me into every room, into every silence, into every moment I spent alone with my thoughts. If my husband ever found out, everything would be over. The life we had built, the home we had created, the fragile foundation we stood on, it would all crumble to dust. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had already fallen apart long before this. That maybe, deep down, I had been waiting for something, anything, to remind me I was still alive. Every day after that night felt like walking on a knife's edge. I told myself to be normal, to act as though nothing had changed, to pretend. But pretending felt like drowning. Because every time we were in the same room, every time his presence filled the air around me, I felt it all over again. That electricity, that heat, that undeniable, unforgivable desire. And worse, I saw it in him too. In the way his eyes would flicker toward me when he thought I wasn't looking. In the way his jaw clenched whenever my husband was near. In the way his fingers would flex at his sides, like he was holding himself back from something he shouldn't want. I told myself I had two choices. Bury it. Lock it away. Never let it surface again. Or give in. Let myself fall. Let myself be reckless. Just this once. Just once more. Just one more moment. But I knew the truth. There was no such thing as just once more. This wasn't something that could be undone. And yet, as much as I told myself to walk away, to put a stop to it before it was too late, I already knew it was too late. I had already fallen. And I wasn't sure I wanted to be saved. So now, here I am, sitting in the aftermath, wrapped in silence, wrapped in guilt, wrapped in want. And I can't tell you what comes next. I don't know what I'll do. I don't know if I have the strength to walk away, or if I even want to. Maybe you've been here before. Maybe you felt this war inside yourself, this pull towards something you know is wrong but feels so right in the moment. So tell me, have you ever found yourself caught between desire and morality? Between the life you've built and the temptation that threatens to unravel it? If you were in my shoes, what would you do? Would you bury it, pretend it never happened? Or would you give in, let yourself fall, knowing you could never take it back? Let me know in the comments. I need to hear your thoughts. And if this story left you breathless, if it left you questioning, if it made you feel something you weren't expecting to feel, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga. Because trust me, this is just the beginning. The thing about life is that it doesn't give you warnings. It doesn't tell you when you're about to make the biggest mistake of your life. It doesn't tell you when a single moment, a single kiss, a single look will change everything. It just happens. And then you're left with nothing but the consequences. Maybe this was never really about him. Maybe this was about me. A woman who had been lonely for far too long. A woman who just wanted to be seen. A woman who made a choice she can't take back. And maybe you're sitting there, judging me. Maybe you're thinking, I would never do this. I would never let it get this far. But are you sure? Because sometimes the lines between right and wrong blur when loneliness takes hold. And one moment of weakness can change everything forever.